Asyle, the engineer, and the island. Week 46, Day 1. Yep, still raining pretty heavily. Feels like the weather's taunting me now that I'm so close to finally getting something finished, but what else is new? I changed out the vortex drill battery grumpily and decided to get back to my microbiological studies. I think one upside to this field of research is probably that it will never be finished, so I'll always have something to do. I once again alternated between describing cultures, testing their responses to different stimuli, and washing off and labeling test tubes of different phage species. Among the new microbes, I found what I suspected to be a species of yeast, which I gave a little extra attention to and set aside for more extensive future experiments. As for the phage studies, progress was understandably slow, responses from the bacterial cultures being marginal at best, but artificial selection is a slow process, even for creatures that reproduce as fast as bacteria, so I have to be patient. At one point, I turned on the radio so I could listen to something while I worked, between automated Bible recordings, of course. It was while I was listening that I realized something. My transmitter was off. It has been for some time, and I haven't done anything about it. Dozens of ships or planes might have passed me by. And while the thought took me just a little aback for a moment, the honest truth is, I think I'm okay with that. I don't really want to leave as badly as I used to. Yes, I'm still lonely, but outside of my immediate family, I'm not convinced anyone's really going to miss me, or that anyone else really wanted me. It's a depressing thought, but I think that not only am I probably going to be alone for the rest of my life on this island, but in some ways, it might actually be for the best. I took a step back to try and process this. It's a pain so deep and old now that I couldn't cry about it even if I wanted to. After having my moment, I turned off the radio. I didn't want to hear human voices anymore, reminding me that I was alone, and so different from everyone else that I always would be. At least here, there's no one to remind me of that. And in some ways, that's a relief. I stopped for lunch, and then got back to my Myst writing, moving on to the stone ship age, which was, for some reason, always a bit forgettable to me. However, in the story, there was the implication that there were other civilizations on this age that Cirrus and Achenar presumably subjugated, as evidenced by all the big maps in Cirrus's room on the island. That would have presumably made this small island a maritime hub, so I did my best to try and expand it as such. Naturally, the lighthouse and telescope would have been helpful for guiding and detecting approaching vessels. But why have rooms deep below the waterline, inaccessible and inescapable unless the pump is on? Some kind of panic room? And how would they go about subjugating these people without a navy of their own? Cirrus strikes me as the type who could convince anyone to do anything for him. A manipulator. So as long as he had a means of communication, he might have been able to get the inhabitants of the age to do whatever he wanted, only occasionally having to get on a boat and to meet with people in person. In that respect, the primary function of this island would have been as a transport hub, so it may have required little more than some extended docks. Achenar, on the other hand, would probably have enjoyed destroying things, even the boats coming to visit them, not only by guiding them onto the craggy rocks with false messages from the lighthouse, but perhaps even by shooting them with a cannon, so I added one to the ship parts embedded in the rocks. As a final reveal at the end of the chapter, I added one more detail, namely that out the underwater window, there could be seen dozens, if not hundreds, of sunken ships around the island, which the brothers presumably sunk one at a time as the age outlived its usefulness to them. Week 46, Day 2. A break in the weather. I was frankly expecting the meteorological joke to persist for most of the week. I didn't even bother with my morning chores, immediately smelting down my copper ore, mostly into wire, but I saved a little for metal films so I could make my electronic commutator. While I had the kiln active, I whipped up some heavy-duty resistors for the lights in the tunnel and installed them later. As soon as the wire was cool enough to handle, I insulated it with latex and started winding my last transformer core. It was time to get this show on the road. I disconnected my cables leading down into the tunnels and connected the transformers at either end, low turns on the motor/generator sides, and high turns on the transmission line side. I then decided to remove the generator from the wind turbine and hook it back up to the water wheel instead, which would produce a much more consistent power output. I then removed the commutator elements from the generator and motor. Because they basically have the same dimensions relative to each other, the torque on one should be translated straight into the other with minimal losses, almost as though the water wheel were turning the drill directly. They would probably function more effectively at a higher, more controlled frequency, but there wasn't a lot I could do to control that. And even mains electricity is able to run relatively efficiently at a paltry 60 Hz. Once everything was hooked up, I gave it a test. There appeared to be some losses getting the motor up to speed with the generator, probably due to the coil gaps not being as tight as possible, and maybe some phase shifting problems, but eventually I was able to tease out all the problems and get the Tesla turbine running with most of the water wheel's power. These phase shift problems could probably be fixed if I could stagger the coils and rotate them relative to each other, but that'll have to wait until I have much more copper and iron to extend them with, if ever. There were also a few burnouts in the lights, which I had to shut down the grid to fix. With that in mind, I spent some time building a few big switches to safely shut down the high voltage power flow, and some fuses to break the circuit in case there was a short in the future, which amounted to little more than wires of calculated size housed inside a protective casing. I then stopped for lunch before moving on to building the electronic commutator. I built an electrolytic transistor with bipolar input and output terminals, and hooked its gate terminal to the power supply. That way, as it measures the alternating current in the power supply, it should shift the power flow between the two input and output terminals. I then hooked up the output leads so that the power would always flow in one direction, in this case through the electrolysis tub. I added a big capacitor to the circuit as well to even out the inevitable pulses. Of course, I couldn't hook this circuit up to the middle of the power grid, not without another step-down transformer, so for the time being, it was actually easier to just hook it right up to the generator and temporarily move the electrolysis tub and battery chargers back into the workshop. It was at this point that I realized, fortunately, that I was going to have to do the same thing for the underwater dome, and build a transformer and commutator for it as well. For today, however, I just hooked it up to the commutator in the workshop by long wires, which will incur more resistance losses, but not be much worse overall than the load I was already putting on the whole system. I I then reburied my cables and decided that it was time to celebrate. Hopefully, in a few months I'll at least double my electrical power output. I decided to prepare for dinner a little early and make another vanilla grass cake, along with boiling down a lot of sugar cane to try making soda again. I lit my lamps for the evening, and after dinner, stayed up a little late playing around with Pokemon while I ate my cake. Week 46, Day 3. The rain was back in full force again today, but I didn't care too much. Instead, I stayed indoors and mostly attended to my microbiological studies again, though this time with a bit more of a purpose. I've managed to identify and isolate several different species of yeast by this time, and having cultured them overnight, I was prepared to test a few of them on the bottles of sugar water I prepared the other day. So just before lunch, I inoculated a few of my bottles with different yeast species. I didn't fill the bottles completely, and there wasn't a lot of yeast going into each one, so both of those factors combined meant it was going to take a long time to get any carbonation out of them. However, while I was working on this, I got the idea to build a special cork for the bottles, consisting mostly of a long, thin, hollowed-out straw of bamboo and a small ball of rubber at the end to act as a one-way valve. I took a couple of additional pieces of bamboo and turned this apparatus into a small piston pump to allow me to pre-pressurize the bottles so they won't lose what carbonation they accumulate, the straw bubbling into the sugar water and not the bottle itself. I ran into an issue though with the cork popping out, so I had the idea to put a sort of sleeve over it that split open when compressed, kind of like a molly bolt, to keep the corks on the bottle while under pressure. I'll have to press into them to get the cork back out, and the pressure will cause the soda to squirt out of the straw like an aerosol spray can, so I can functionally make my own soda fountain. Fun! I didn't have time to finish making more than one before lunch, but afterwards I built more and installed them on all of my bottles, being careful to avoid over-pressurizing them, which could cause them to rupture. I left them in the kitchen where it was still relatively warm to settle, and I don't expect them to carbonate for at least a week. I then spent the remainder of the afternoon continuing with my Myst writing, this time focusing on the mechanical age, another one that I liked well enough, but the design of which didn't make much sense for its stated purpose. I get that it was basically a big fortress, but I didn't see why it needed to rotate to perform this function, especially against maritime assailants. If the point was just to keep them from being able to reach the entrance, a door would have been much less complicated. The only thing that would make sense would be for the island to basically function as a big cannon turret, which would also presumably be much more effective at repelling the invaders that the island's inhabitants feared. Though I also recognize that this isn't really Adris's style. What could possibly require that much heavy-duty machinery, as well as necessitating that the entire fortress rotate and not just the weapon, whatever presumably non-lethal form it took? Unless, of course, the tower housed all of the requisite mechanics and needed to be kept in line with the firing mechanism. If this tower was being used as a turret, then it would also need a renewable ammo supply, so the inhabitants of the age wouldn't run out or become dependent on Adris to provide it for their protection. So that implies it had to either be using seawater or wind as its ammo, which also seemed like a reasonably non-lethal but effective means of repelling what are presumably sail-driven vessels. Possibly even a mechanism that produced tidal waves. The latter frankly seemed to me to be the most reasonable explanation for needing such big mechanical elements, as it would have been a lot of water to displace. So I started to overhaul the design of the mechanical age, in such a fashion that it actually began getting a Ghibli feel to it, like it was basically a big metal castle or tank with lookout towers on it to send directions to the gunner with different distinctive sounds, which could be heard much more effectively over the sound of the clanking gearworks in the control room than with a speaking tube or the like, which finally gave some sense to the central puzzle of the level. At the same time, though, this was supposed to be a place where people lived, so I likewise expanded it to have sleeping quarters and a galley, kind of like a ship. However, some rooms had also obviously been taken over by Cirrus and Achenar as their personal throne rooms, along with their hidden gold hoard and torture room respectively, which I added to the new layout in such a way that the whole thing felt much more like a steampunk castle. I can imagine the brothers either figuring out how to modify the tidal wave weapon, or bluffing about its capabilities in such a way that they held the inhabitants of this age for ransom, and thus gained control over them, making mechanical their capital, and it's heavily implied that they destroyed whoever the aggressors on this age were, and left their sunken boats nearby as a reminder of their power. I didn't have quite enough time to finish writing this overhaul, however, because I started late, and it was a lot more work than just copying my memory of the source material directly. Week 46, Day 4. There was hardly a cloud in the sky today. The weather certainly has been erratic lately. I did my morning chores and decided that I needed to spend the day making paper while the sun was shining. So, while I was out, I collected extra plant material and spent the day soaking, grinding, flattening, and spinning. Around lunchtime, though, I stopped and checked on my microbe cultures to make sure things weren't growing completely out of control again, and to separate and test any potential phage cultures. Other than that, there's not a lot to write about today. Just keeping busy. Though it's nice to think a little bit about what I'm going to do with all this paper later. More stories and games, I imagine. Week 46, Day 5. It was another nice day today, so after my morning chores, I decided to spend much of it tending the taro garden, which has been somewhat abused by the bad weather. Fortunately, though, being more or less in a clearing and low to the ground, the leaves have been spared a lot of the damage from the wind, mostly palm branches I needed to clear off of them, and a little bit of weeding. The yams were mostly protected under their thatching, however. I took note of a few specimens that were getting a little moldy, and this gave me an idea to collect the spores and culture this particular mold to see if I could isolate and cultivate a virus specific to it, which I can use to keep my crops protected in place of some kind of pesticide. I stopped for lunch at that point, and with the temperature rising, I went inside and worked on repairing some of my tools in the workshop, particularly my axe, but while I was there, I repaired a lot of the other pieces of equipment, like the crusher, the drill, the lathe, and the loom. It's kind of turned into a mini maintenance day, and I kinda like it. While I was in the workshop, I noticed the iron plates in the electrolysis cell were done, and while I didn't have any immediate use for them, I reloaded the cell with pyrite, which I was starting to run out of, and set the plates aside for later use. Week 46, Day 6. It was overcast and drizzly today. I expect the heavy rains will be coming back soon. I considered making today another mining day, as I had plenty of chemicals stockpiled for it, but it just wasn't as urgent today. Instead, I spent the morning foraging in the drizzle, and then got back to my microbe cultures. The fungal specimens I collected yesterday didn't grow nearly as fast as the bacterial cultures, but that was more or less to be expected. Because my experiments were becoming more involved, though, I made a note that I would have to make more petri dishes and test tubes when the sun comes out again. I could at least make more petri dishes right away, and started grinding them in the workshop. In the meantime, I put on my diving suit to collect more seaweed, and cooked it during lunch, though the smell didn't really help my appetite. Afterwards, I got back to my writing projects. It was kind of mentally invigorating to get a break from it for a few days, as fun as it's otherwise been. I finished off some of the stuff I had in mind for the mechanical age, and then more or less finished off the shorter sections describing the endgame, particularly the remains of the city of Denis. It taxed my memory a little, though, to remember the dialogue as perfectly as I could, and especially to figure out how to make the fireplace puzzle work for the code system I worked out. Eventually, I had the idea to use the pressed buttons on the grid in combination with XY coordinates to basically use the coordinates of the buttons as the key to the cipher, though this also required me to spend some time making a whole bunch of false codes for the back of the book, which I felt wasted a fair amount of paper. Week 46, Day 7. The weather was clear today, and it was Sabbath again, so I started with my morning chores, thankful that I didn't have to lug that heavy lead battery up and down the volcanic shaft anymore, before transcribing my radio recordings, listening to the sermon, and heading back down into the underwater dome. The sharks seemed excited to see me, but I've watched enough videos on animal behavior to know how important it is to decouple yourself from the stimulus of food. That's what the shark collar especially is for. As expected, the bamboo has been growing in first in the underwater garden, but everything has been growing in much more slowly than on land, again, probably because of the reduced light and carbon dioxide levels in the dome. After lunch, I got back to my writing, and had some fun by writing in the secret age of rhyme, which was only shown in the real Myst version of the game. It's a world of ice, snow, and glaciers, and while I was writing, I tried hard to remember the delicious feeling of a chill wind against your back. It wasn't essential to the story, but I wanted to add it in as a sort of extra reward for winning, as well as teasing Riven. I tried to describe it as I remembered it, and to take liberties where it seemed right. I remember the passages feeling a bit cozy. I remembered the spectacle of the machines Atris used to modulate the colors of the aurora, and the ice-cold imager that used differently shaped and colored crystals to make Riven visible. It was kind of just a treat to remember, because the Myst franchise has always meant so much to me. In fact, it was reading Atris's never-ending journals that inspired me to start keeping one of my own, so the Miller brothers can probably be blamed for this one too, along with the uncountable ways that journaling has helped me psychologically over the years. For that reason, I think I developed a different context for what journals were supposed to be used for, and to some degree why I'm still writing one now. To me, journals aren't just private diaries for personal secrets and introspection. Journals are meant to be read, to give context for the surroundings they're found in, to give clues for solving puzzles, and insight into the artists who made them, especially if they're long dead, as I frankly will expect to be the case for anyone who happens upon this one someday. I think that different context was part of the reason why my family never entirely seemed to understand why I asked them to read it, or pieces of it, when I felt alone and longed to be understood. Blooper Reel. I changed out the vortex drill battery. battery. Among the new microbes, what the heck is a microbe? Naturally, the lighthouse only occasionally having to get on a boat and to meet with people in person. Only occasionally. Oh, occasionally. Okay, I've reached the point in recording that my tongue has stopped working. It's only been half an hour. Press stop instead of pause. Waluigi sounds. And to get the Tesla turbine running with most of the power from the water wheel. Why do I keep losing my spot? That way, as it measures the alternating current in the power supply, it should shift. Okay, there's a typo. That's a would, not a should. Of course, I couldn't herk this circuit which will incur more resistance losses, but not me, and the pressure will cause the soda to squirt out of the straw under pressure, like that's under pressure twice. Pause for edits. And it was a lot more work than just coppering my memory, which I can use to keep my props corrected. Thankful that I didn't have to lug that heavy lead battery up and down the volcanic shaft anymore. Hold on, is something wonky about this? Stop. Is there something wonky about the recording? I see now. I had the recording volume down. How much of that am I going to have to redo? It's fine. We'll edit it. There's no need to shout. I tried to describe it as I remembered it, and to liberties where it seemed right. Hey there. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. At last the power grid is up, and I can spend my time and legs doing other things than lugging that car battery up and down a 50-foot shaft. So, if you want to find out what I'm going to do with all that free time, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as the next episode is ready. Now, although I said I'm starting to make peace with spending the rest of my life alone on this island, I think the fact that I'm still making these videos and transmitting them to the entire internet is proof that I don't entirely believe that. So, if you're willing, it would really help me out, more than anything else, if you could share these videos with someone who you think would enjoy them, or who would at least relate to this feeling. If you want to share some of your own thoughts, stories, or perspectives on the episode, maybe about how journaling has benefited your mental health over the years, or how some of your favorite stories or games inspired you, like Myst did for me, feel free to share them in the comments below. I genuinely love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. In fact, I'd like to give a little plug that I meant to do last week for the Myst TTRPG called Unwritten, and the author playing it with her friends here on YouTube. Link to the playlist should be popping up in the corner right about now. Not sponsored, I just enjoyed it and wanted to share. All that said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.